Icbm.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. On this Friday, we're going to be discussing something that happened 57 years back, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was this week, on October 16th, that the crisis as we know it began. And we're going to look back at it and see what it has to tell us today about nuclear weapons, about escalation, about crises. To discuss this, I have with me Shibani and Pranav. I'm just going to start by giving a really brief outline, just to remind everybody about what happened. On the morning of October 16th, President John F. Kennedy of the United States was briefed about the presence of Soviet MRBM missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles, in Cuba. And at this point, the Americans were faced with some difficult choices. Broadly, the three choices were to do nothing and just live with the situation. The other was to have a blockade of Cuba. And the third was to actually go to war, to try and destroy those weapons. The Americans eventually chose the second option, a blockade, though they couldn't actually call it a blockade because that would legally mean war. They called it a quarantine. And so they set up a quarantine of Cuba and didn't let Soviet ships enter Cuban territory. In the meantime, diplomacy slowly took hold. October 26th onwards, Khrushchev, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and Kennedy started talking, and by October 28th, they started coming towards a resolution. And finally, the Soviets withdrew their missiles from Cuba. The Americans had a secret agreement with them to remove similar Jupiter missiles from Turkey, though this was not made public until much later. Those missiles were removed eventually in April of 1963, so several months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And all seemed fine after that. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the times when humanity has been really close to all-out nuclear war. In fact, it may be the only real nuclear crisis in all history, because there are lots of other crises in which nuclear weapons, which occur under the shadow of nuclear weapons, but this was a crisis that was about nuclear weapons. So I want to start with you, Shibani. One of the seminal books about the Cuban Missile Crisis is, of course, Graham Allison's The Essence of Decision, and he basically has these three models. Can you tell us about these models and what they tell us about the crisis and decision-making?
Right. So before I get into the models themselves, I think it's important to talk about why the study of the crisis continues to be relevant when you talk about international relations, foreign policy analysis, or even just crisis management within governments. The study that Allison did looks at all aspects of government, from the individual to the organization to the government as an actor on the whole. And the lessons that the case study, that you can derive from the case study, are more or less applicable in any crisis situation, which is why it's continued to, remain relevant in IR classrooms. Like you were saying, the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, I think Allison begins his study with a quote about how the Soviet Union and the US were eyeball to eyeball in those 13 days. And an extension of that is to see whether the other person would blink or not. The three models that are used to study or that have been applied to the case are the rational actor model, the organizational behavior model, as well as the governmental politics model. Each of them look at the crisis from a different stakeholder or group of stakeholders and sort of derive lessons for analysts to use in their study.
Okay, so you have three basic models, the rational, the government, and bureaucratic models.
Right.
Tell us about the rational actor model. What does it tell us about how the crisis was handled?
So the rational actor model is a very basic model that looks at purpose and action. what was the purpose of, say, the US administration under John F. Kennedy, and therefore what were the actions that were taken. Similarly, on the Soviet side, what was the purpose of the leadership and what actions in that direction did they take. So while it sounds elementary in this simplistic explanation that I'm giving right now, the rational actor model also looks at the context in which these actions are being studied. So what was the domestic polity in the United States at the time when the crisis was unfolding? What was happening in Soviet Union at the time? From this, you're able to map out, it's a very cost and benefit sort of analysis that is carried out. And you also map the actor's readiness to take a certain action given the risks involved in proceeding in that way. As I said, the three models look at every part of the government and then also at the government as a whole. The second model, which is the organizational behavior model, looks at how a government as an organization or an institution functions. So what are the standard operating procedures in place? How do governments respond to a crisis? How quickly are they able to turn around? What is the nature of information sharing within the various arms? Because you have to understand that a threat to national security involves the coordination of multiple agencies within the government. It involves a lot of people. So the study of that itself helps better understand the crisis and what it means for foreign policy analysis. The third one is the governmental politics model, focuses on the individual. So, say, what role did the foreign minister of the Soviet Union have in the decisions that were made? Did the personality of Robert McNamara influence what was happening in the US at the time? Did the information that each of these individuals have, how they analyzed it, how they interpreted it, what was their calculation of risks, and how that sort of weighed in on the final decision or the action that was carried out? So these are the three, I would say, levels at which you can study the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So quite interesting. You mentioned that what was political context behind this? And this is an important time because political context here was changing with respect to nuclear policy. Before 1961, the United States had this policy of massive retaliation, where if they noticed that even a small advancement in conventional forces into Eastern Europe, out of Eastern Europe towards Western Europe, the Americans would launch this massive nuclear attack on Soviet Union. They had a whole range of targets that were selected, right? But what happened was this would lead to a total annihilation, and they sort of changed that, and they went to give options. They wanted more flexibility. They wanted more options on the table. They wanted more cards. So they went to this thing called flexible response, where your tactical nuclear weapons would have much more of a bigger role, which would give you flexibility to escalate in a very limited fashion. So that was a political context, and this happened during the time of Kennedy, when Kennedy was really, really unhappy with what was there before. And the second thing that was quite interesting you mentioned is how organizations functions. They have quite routines and they have SOPs. However, what's quite interesting is that, a crisis was averted because somebody did not follow the SOP. Here are three interesting things that I found. So during the crisis, there was actually a standard routine Icbm testing that was going on at Vandenberg Air Force Base. And what happened was this was quite standard. They would do this once every few days. And what happened was the government did not notify them that there was a crisis going on. And the Cubans had the Soviets had placed missiles in Cuba. So this notification didn't go on. There was no notification about a quarantine. So these guys in the Air Force Base did a routine test. Thankfully, on the Soviet side, they did not see this as a threat, or at least they thought twice before taking up any action. Second thing was, very interestingly, there was a CIA double agent named Oleg Penikovsky. So he was a double agent whose job was, if he noticed a Soviet advancement into Western Europe, he would suddenly make a call to the CIA, which would signal that there was an advancement being made. During the crisis, he was actually caught by the Soviet Union. He was actually caught by the KGB. But he made a call anyway. We don't know why he made the call, but he rang the CIA, which was the signal. Thankfully, somebody in the CIA thought twice, and they did not trigger any alarm. So these are two things where you have standard SOPs, but it's in a context that is very, very dynamic. You are in a crisis, there's a lot more information flowing in, and it might provide room for escalation, right? You might provide room for confusion, misperception, and ultimately it may lead to war. Thankfully, somebody didn't follow it up, and thankfully crisis was averted.
Yeah, I'll get back to this point that you're making, Pranav, about contingency and how things could easily go wrong. There is no perfect control over the system. Graham Allison actually asks three pertinent questions about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first is simply, why did the Soviet Union decide to place offensive missiles in the first place in Cuba? Second is, why did the United States decide on a blockade? Remember, if you recall, they had three options: to do nothing, to blockade, or to go to war. Why did they choose the second option? And three, why did the Soviet Union decide to withdraw missiles? And I think we can apply all three levels to these questions. So, for instance, the question of why the Soviets decided to move missiles to Cuba. Well, one rational explanation would be simply that the Americans had done something similar by placing Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which gave very little warning time for attacks on southern Soviet Union.
I think another thing from the rational actor model, if we were to extend, is that a nuclear war is mutual destruction and therefore suicide. So neither the US nor the Soviet Union would have actually gone to war with each other using nuclear weapons if they are to be studied as rational actors.
Sure, absolutely. That would very much explain the last question. Also, on the other hand, you have organizational impetus, right? So Cuba was one of those revolutions that took place independent of the Soviet Union. And for the Soviets, this was their foot in the door in the Western Hemisphere. And there was an emotional appeal to supporting a communist government. And finally, in a matter of personality or politics, Khrushchev always has to look over his shoulder. He's a very pugnacious man. He believes that he can take advantage of Kennedy. He's met Kennedy the previous year. He feels Kennedy is a noob, basically. And, he decides he can do something about it. Now, why did the United States decide on a quarantine or blockade? Again, so rational actor model will tell you that's obvious because that's the least risky option that still allows you to do something about the situation. But I really wonder, what if Kennedy had decided not to do anything? Would it have really made a huge amount of material difference to the nuclear relationship? I think that's something we can debate.
Had Kennedy not done anything?
Yes.
I'm going to try and look at this from the organizational behavior model and say that given the amount of panic that was created in the White House, the concept of fog that is usually used in times of war, where you don't have complete information of what is happening on the other side, as well as you probably don't have information of what's happening on your side as well. So your options become very narrow. And I would understand that the Kennedy administration believed that not doing something was not an option. Yeah. They had to react, even if it was just symbolic power projection.
But let's look at this in a more counterfactual fashion. So you would have missiles in Cuba, Soviet missiles in Cuba. The Americans would be more afraid of getting attacked directly on land than thinking about extended deterrence, right? They would have to be less worried about what was going to happen in Europe, and their immediate concern would be what's going to happen on our ground. So for American leaders, the question would have been, do we still maintain an alliance commitment? Do we still allow them to, do we still extend our nuclear umbrella to them? Or do we just take care of ourselves and allow the British, the French, and even the Germans to develop their own nuclear weapons? Because one of the reasons why the Germans were dissuaded from building their own arsenal was America's assurance that they would have a nuclear umbrella.
So your argument over there is very much rational actor model. You're saying that this would have actually put the Americans in a strategically disadvantageous position.
Yeah, and they would have concentrated more on defending their homeland than Western Europe. And if they had done nothing, we might have very well seen more nuclear weapons in Western Europe.
Right. And then there's just one other point about this, which is probably about personalities. John F. Kennedy's military advisors were all pretty certain that he should just destroy those missiles. He decided against it, I think, partly because of a different temperament, being a civilian, though he of course, he had served in the Second World War. But I think it's also because a failure had occurred the previous year, the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Yeah.
And he had felt that his advisors, both in the military and intelligence community, had misled him. And so there was less appetite for military action against Cuba. I think that's one of those contingent factors that involve personality and past history that affect such decisions. I want to get to the third question, which is the most crucial one. Why did the Soviets decide to withdraw missiles? The obvious answer, the rational actor model answer, is, of course, that this was a game of chicken. Neither side would benefit from an escalation or all-out nuclear war, and so they did the rational thing. But are there other explanations?
Well, obviously, the whole secret pact to withdraw Jupiter missiles from Turkey.
That's very rational again, right?
Yeah, but this was done in secret, right? So in hindsight, we might think, oh, the Soviets got scared of American blockade and they withdrew. But this was actually a risk reduction measure that was taken on both sides. A rational actor model, but still something that would not have come, would have actually thought of.
Also, I think this is a time to mention that while we have a lot of information about what happened in the White House during those 13 days, there isn't the same amount of information about what went down in the Kremlin.
Absolutely.
And we are not as aware of the internal dynamics of the people advising Khrushchev and what their personalities were like, what their personal interests were, and maybe that could have had an influence on the final decision.
Yeah, undoubtedly. Historians will tell you that Khrushchev's position was weakened after the Cuban Missile Crisis, eventually leading to his ouster. But I just want to throw a few rhetorical bombs over here. This is talked about as a nuclear crisis, and it was really the only nuclear crisis in all history. But it also seems a lot like older wars or crises to me. This is America enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, which dates back to the 19th century. The US could enforce this blockade over Cuba precisely because its navy could control those waters which were close to home in a way that the Soviets could not. So it would seem to me that conventional forces were actually very important and critical in ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, but Shibani, obviously not everybody agrees with this. A lot of people would tell us that actually American nuclear superiority gave it a negotiating advantage.
Right. So one of the arguments made in favor of the US is that given its strategic nuclear advantage at the time, the USA could choose lower level conventional, or should I say actually military means to threaten the Soviet Union without fearing a nuclear escalation. And I think that is a very strong argument.
Yeah, but is it necessarily an argument for superiority, or is it an argument also for just mutual deterrence?
I would just say that American missiles were left vulnerable because Soviet missiles were much closer. So your superiority goes because the Soviets could still hold a bunch of your missiles at risk, right? And where does your superiority go? What are you threatening to destroy? Are you threatening to destroy only the Soviet IRBMs in Cuba? Or are you trying to say, I'm going to destroy the entire Soviet Union because you have a few missiles in Cuba? So I believe that your superiority takes a second step there. And your first step would be, what are my direct vulnerabilities and what is the direct threat to my national security? Aditya brought up Monroe Doctrine. Would this weaken American regional hegemonic position? Absolutely, because you have Soviets entering the Western Hemisphere, and this will be the most insecure position the US would have been in.
90 miles off Key West.
Exactly.
I just mentioned a game of chicken, and this Cuban Missile Crisis is often likened to a game of chicken. The movie Rebel Without the Cause, you have that famous scene where two guys race their cars towards a cliff, and the guy who gets out last is the winner. So who blinks first? Who blinked first in the Cuban Missile Crisis? Is it clear?
Who blinked first to do what? Who blinked first to take action, or who blinked first to remove the missiles?
Yeah, so that's what. It's really unclear to me that one side blinked first. The Americans were, of course, very clear that the Soviets blinked. And in a sense, their argument would be that Khrushchev agreed to keep the US withdrawal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey secret. But it's not really clear to me. And there's two levels of brinksmanship. There's the political level of brinksmanship, and there's also the level of brinksmanship at sea, where the Soviets have to be convinced that these Americans are going to fire on them if they try and break that quarantine. The crisis actually reaches a peak on October 27th, of course. A bunch of crazy things happen. American U-2 spy plane is shot down over Cuba and the pilot is killed. Another U-2, American U-2, on a routine reconnaissance mission strays into Soviet territory, which could obviously scare the Soviets into thinking the Americans are up to no good. And then you have the case of a Soviet submarine heading towards Cuba. The Americans are trying to scare it off, and they don't scare it off nicely. They use depth charges.
Yeah.
This is crazy.
You never use depth charges for submarines because you always have the threat of them blowing up.
Right. And inside the submarine, the air conditioning has stopped working. So the temperature is something like 40 degrees centigrade. And everybody's sweating, exhausted, and probably not thinking clearly. And the captain decides he's going to use his nuclear torpedoes to attack those American ships. And when you don't have authority from the people on top, you need your captain, your second captain, and your political officer to agree. The captain and the political officer agreed. It was just the second captain that did not agree. And so they did not fire their nuclear torpedoes. It's a really fascinating counterfactual to me. What if those nuclear torpedoes had been fired?
Or even, you mentioned the U-2 incident. When they were escorting the U-2, there were actually 2 fighter jets armed with air-to-air nuclear missiles, right? What if these guys had retaliated? What if these guys had fired as an interceptor? You have no idea what could have happened.
Yes.
I think all of these point to the role of time in a crisis. Do you start getting more impatient as the crisis continues? Like 13 days is a long time. And how does it, like you said, okay, people in the submarine were, exhausted and tired and feeling hot. Was the leadership obviously going through a similar fatigue, mental fatigue as well? Do you just want to get over with it and, get them?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's one of the fundamental problems with these crises, with having rational models for these crises, is that they just don't take these factors into account. Going back to Rebel Without a Cause, 2 guys again are racing towards a cliff, and the guy who gets out of his car last, just before his vehicle goes over the cliff, is the winner. One of these guys gets his sleeve stuck in the car door and is unable to get out in time. So he flies off the cliff. Of course, he wins, but yeah, he dies also. So that sort of seems to tell us about this whole problem of contingency. In a crisis where you have such complicated things going on, you have high tensions. As Shibani pointed out, there's just time and exhaustion. There's physical discomfort. There's so many things that could go wrong. And obviously, it's a miracle that nothing went wrong in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what does it tell us about, say, if similar crises were to occur today? How do you reduce the role of such contingency?
I think that the first thing would happen is somebody would rant on Twitter. Some leader would rant on Twitter and they'd be like, let's get this thing over with. And they'll try to shorten it. I don't think they'll think over patiently. They'll be like, what can be done right now? What can we do right now? And this is where the thing of crunching time comes. How can we shorten things and how can we get maximum benefit for ourselves? That's always funny to me. What if we had Twitter during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Interesting times to see tweets from both sides.
I'm sure Krishna would have posted a gif of himself banging his shoes on the desk.
They probably use it to create more misinformation and, information asymmetry on the other side.
Yeah, in fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a time when mass television was exploding. The presidential election, Kennedy's presidential election was the first televised election of that sort. The crisis itself, Kennedy made a speech on television. So it was actually one of those crises where mass media played a major role. And we have no idea how social media will influence future crises.
And look at the amount of time it took from discovering the Cuban missiles to actually televising them. A very short number of days. I think about 4 days.
Yeah.
Yeah. And imagine that. We saw that Donald Trump posted a picture of an Iranian rocket test. Imagine you could do that. You could just take a picture from your spy satellite and put it on social media and say, hey guys, here we have the proof. We have the proof that these guys are placing missiles. Let's tell them not to do it.
And like it is true for leaders of today, I think Kennedy was also keeping in mind how this would impact him domestically and his position with his own people.
Yeah, the cynical part of me just looks to the midterm elections that were coming up in the US. Yeah. But anyway, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Shibani and Pranav. And I hope that this podcast interested you. If you'd like us to do more such podcasts, please let us know. You can reach me at AdityaR22.
You can tweet to me at Mehtasaurus.
I'm available on Pran_RS.
Thank you, guys.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Look! Up in the internet! It's a meme! No! It's a cat video! No! It's the Geek Fruit Podcast!
That's right, we interrupt this riveting broadcast to tell you about our show, The Geek Fruit Podcast, where Tejas, Dinkar, and I, Jishnu, talk about everything in pop culture, including DC, Marvel, Star Wars, Netflix, and everything in between.
You know how your friends hate it when you ramble about some nerdy crap and you just want somebody to listen to you? Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about that, but come listen to us ramble and it'll almost be like the real thing. Kind of.
Listen to new episodes of the Geek Fruit Podcast every Monday and the Geek Fruit Bulletin every Thursday on iTunes, Google Podcasts, the IVM app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy listening, you nerds.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.